this is such an exciting nail biter time, and I just can't wait to hear from Steve. So let's go straight ahead. And Steve, hi.
Hey, how are you today?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Good. Emma and I have lots of travels together, so we have our own special rapport.
But nothing this nail-bitingly close to the presidential election. So I wanted to start with some real nuts and bolts. And basically, Steve, how do you predict the outcome of an election? What factors play a role when you're trying to predict the outcome of especially a presidential election?
Uh, so there are fundamental factors, especially the economy, that political scientists and economists have long known are kind of the best predictors year in, year out. In addition, the popularity of the president, if there's an incumbent president running for re-election, is a strong predictor. So the key indicator that has proven most reliable has been the percent change in real personal disposable income. Now that's a mouthful, but it's adjusting for inflation and taxes. Has your income gone up or down? And if you have normal economic growth like we do now, then the incumbent president is favored. That model works extremely well when there are incumbents running for election. When there's no incumbent on the ticket, it's more random. And one of the key questions we have right now as social scientists is this going to look more like the incumbent running or the incumbent not running? The last two times we've had this happen, where an incumbent president decides not to run for re-election fairly late in the process. Um, uh, well, one of them wasn't fairly late and one of them was Lyndon Johnson in 1968 and Richard Nixon leading into the 1970, following the 1972 election. For Nixon could not have stood for re-election, but the question was like, would Ford get credit for that economy? And would Humphrey in 1968 get credit for Johnson's economy? And neither of them did. It was very close elections. Both were 50-50 elections. So I suspect this is more like those situations than like a normal incumbent running to try to win re-election with a fairly good economy.
So let's follow up on that because we've got another beautiful spanner in the works, which is you know, remember I'm a pretty new American citizen myself, 7 years. So I'm learning a lot. But thinking about an added twist to the tale is how short the running time will have been for Kamala Harris against Donald Trump. It will have been a total of 4 months, which is not very long. How does that very truncated campaign timeline affect who actually comes out to vote and who they vote for?
I don't think it'll have much of an effect on who comes out to vote, though I think there's more enthusiasm among younger voters than there had been with Biden on the ticket. I think a lot of younger voters are like two 70-year-olds or 80-year-olds in the case of Biden, like, where am I in this? What these people are not connected to anything remotely near my generation. So I think Harris and JD Vance and Tim Walz bring a lot more of a younger perspective, and I think that's generated some more excitement on both sides, really. Uh, but the other aspect of this is just the organizational complication of taking over a campaign, which is what Harris had to do, taking over an extant campaign. She didn't have the time to start her own campaign. And just think about this being a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And suddenly the top of that corporation gets removed. So a multi-billion-dollar organization, it's already going. And so a new team comes in. And I think there are a lot of questions about how well the new team integrates and can they get up and going smoothly. It does seem to be astonishing how well the Harris team has stepped into the Biden organization. You do hear some frictions here and there, but it's like it's minor compared to other instances where like a campaign manager gets fired and they have to bring a new team in, and it just is a mess. So that's not the situation here, which is, I think, good news for the Harris campaign, that they were able to do that pretty seamlessly. The third aspect of this, though, is that Harris didn't have the advantage of the long vetting that the primaries bring. And we complain about the primaries and the election season being too long every time. And here we are. If you don't like a long election season, this is our test case for it. And people are saying, like, I don't know enough about her, right? So there is a function of the long primary season for Americans of actually really learning what this person stands for. And it benefits the candidates over the course of the general election as well.
That's so interesting. And, as a native Brit, I'm used to the quick and deadly campaign. So it's felt for me a lot more like a British election.
Yeah.
Yeah. We hear a lot about, and we're experiencing a lot of noise, a lot of disinformation about both candidates, both Trump and Harris, and these are originating both within and outside of the US. A lot of attempts to discredit the candidates, and also, basically try and bring down US democracy. There are a lot of reminiscences as I'm thinking about this, so many reminiscences of Rome, which we won't go into, of basically especially claiming that whichever candidate is ruining the state or something like that. How does this disinformation affect voting, or what effect is it likely to have on voting? Does it work as the disinformants are intending?
Well, one of the important facts about the disinformation is that it's coming into our existing media milieu, and most of us are in little bubbles. So what disinformation we're hearing is consistent with what information we're hearing. So it's not really changing much, but it might be kind of reinforcing certain beliefs. And that might be that in and of itself is probably a bad thing for kind of open political discourse in a democracy. You want more talk across, but it's not like the disinformation itself is the cause. It's like the media environment and information environment, the social cultures that we're in. And there's a lot of effort right now to kind of break those down and encourage people to connect across and change some of the architectures of the internet to make it more open. My colleague at MIT, Deb Roy, works just on this, and he was the chief media technologist at Twitter, and now he's like trying to build up a whole new architecture. So I think there's a lot of attempts to do that. It is an amazing miss for the social scientists. Like in the 1980s and 90s, everyone thought that like the rise of the internet was going to completely democratize information and discourse and so forth. It was a very optimistic moment, but I think we kind of missed the call on that one. That didn't see quite clearly enough just how much abuse and susceptibility there would be to different kind of efforts to create disinformation, and also how hard it is to filter it out as a listener. Just how hard it is to know, like, this is right, this is wrong.
So interesting. Very interesting. So following up a bit on that, since we've got bots, we've got cyber terrorism. We've also got such a change in technology, like nobody who answers their phone. I mean, I don't know, maybe I don't think I'm an outlier, but I just on the rare occasions our landline rings, you just don't answer it because it's going to be somebody, trying to
You have a
sell.
landline?
I know. I was feeling a bit embarrassed, even if I said, even as I said that, I should cancel it. But given all that, we're in this period of, a lot of manipulation, a lot of changes in technology. Can we rely on polls? I mean, just even thinking of how they're administered, and obviously in 2016, the polls were wrong. They got the outcome wrong. I mean, should we put any faith in polls at all, given these, the sort of unreliability of the media, of the media of soliciting opinions?
So part of it is what we expect of polls, and at one level we expect almost too much. Like it's a close election, and we expect the polls to help us decipher who's going to win. Like, it's a close election. Don't rely too much on the polls. But polling is its own industry, and it's used for all sorts of things, not just politics. Like most of the commercial marketing you receive and so forth has been studied through some sort of data collection. Almost all of it is some form of a poll. A lot of feedback that you get internally to your organization about how well you're doing, your performance, some sort of poll. Every time you click on the Uber app or the Lyft app and say, yeah, this person, that's a poll, and so forth. So the problem with all of it, and even the old polls, was non-response. Who's responding and who's not responding, and how do you understand that? And one of our colleagues in statistics here in the 1980s and 90s, Don Rubin, just totally innovated the way we think about this. And it's a big mindset change about what a poll is. For I don't know, half a century or more, American academics thought of polls as like, you do a random sample. We had this kind of architecture around it that was very much defined by classical statistics. And the randomness gives you some properties you can count on to answer your question. The innovations of Don Rubin and others like that in statistics changed the way we think about data collection. So it's really like you have a model, you have an idea about how this is going to work. And the poll, the data collection, is helping inform your understanding of parameters in that model, but you really have to have the right model in order to make things work. And it's very interesting that the British have gone in a very different direction than the Americans on polling. So the Americans stick with this idea of like, we've got this random sample, and we just have to make sure it matches with the demography of the electorate or whatever that is. The British went in this other direction that like kind of throws randomness out the window and says, let's go back to the last election and let's really identify a few places and really study them very closely. And all we need to do is understand how things have changed in these places from the last election. So they will like sample 200 places and they will study the swing. And if they can estimate the swing properly, then they can do the election well. As a result, the British polling is really good, and on election night, they're done by 10 p.m. Like we're out of here because they've got the right model. They've got a very good model, and we're still fishing for the right model, and it's very difficult in the polling technology, whatever one we have, because there are different things that affect that non-response rate in ways that make it really hard to reconstruct. So a lot of it is invested in American polling and developing models, and different firms have different models of what the electorate looks like, how the election's going to go, and what they're trying to estimate. But it's like these innovations really change the way we think about polling, and I think in some good ways that put the onus back on like the social scientists, like tell us what the model of the election is, which is where we started this conversation today, rather than let's lean pretty heavily on this assumption of random sampling, which is very hard to ensure. But even with phones, it was really hard to do random sampling just because of non-response. People didn't pick up the phone, and the people who didn't pick up the phone were different from the people who did pick up the phone. And the same was true of face-to-face polls. People who'd answer your door and let you in were really different from people who didn't want to answer the door and let you in. So this has actually been a long bias. When I started at CBS News, one of the deep, dark secrets I learned was that the exit poll, the raw data, not after we
Yeah.
weighted it and tried to adjust it, has always been biased in the Democrats' favor by about 5 points from the
Wow.
70s back. And
Yeah.
so at 5 p.m. on election night, I look at the exit poll and say, what's the margin in the raw data? And is it more than 5 points Democratic or less than 5 points Democratic? So I just subtract five. That's my model of the exit poll is like
So
subtract five
interesting.
and then get started thinking about it.
Wow, wow. I want to ask you a personal question. It's so tempting. Do you respond to, requests for opinions? Do you answer your door? Do you pick up?
It's
We do heard you don't have a landline, but do you pick up the phone? In the service of political science.
back in the days when I did have a landline, I would, but I don't do it with my mobile phone. I just like, and I don't do it online with the internet.
Yeah.
The GSAS should know this, that I'm like terrible at responding to the surveys that you send out.
Unresponsive. Okay. Not even for the cause of getting a better survey. Okay. Okay, I get you. So let's go to, I'd like to think a little bit about election night. And right now, I mean, sort of reading again, I'm going to sound so old-fashioned, reading the newspapers over the weekend. But the polls right now suggest we're very, very close for the outcome. And it looks like there's going to be post-election battles in many states with extremely close margins. Are we going to have a decision on the night of November the 5th, even in the wee hours? Do you think we're going to know by the time any of us go to bed?
So, election night has changed a lot, and this is the lead into my answer, which is in because voting has changed a lot. In 2000, 1 in 8 voters voted in polling places, that is in a precinct, in a like a school or some place that was definable. And so the exit poll will be like interviewing people as they leave, and we had a lot of data on those precincts, and we could kind of track things. Over in the wake of the 2000 election, states liberalized their absentee voting laws, and by 2016, 45% of the vote nationwide was absentee. It jumped to 60 during COVID and shrank back down to 55, but I'm expecting around 60% or maybe more are going to be absentee and early again this year. So we're no longer in the world of the precinct. The models that the networks have developed over the years are very much attuned to the mentality of thinking about the precincts. And we don't have as many tools for sorting through the absentee ballots. The absentee ballots come in differently. They come in a bunch in most states at the county level as opposed to the precinct. So we know less about where those votes are coming from. And if you know where those votes are coming from, you can compare it to last time, and that turns out to be a very good predictor. So it's gotten more complicated because we're dealing with these two different data streams that are going in different directions. Up until 2020, the absentees looked very representative of the precincts. So looked like it wasn't hurting us one way or another to call things on the precincts. But in 2020, the absentees became politicized because the Trump campaign was trying to push more Democratic votes into the absentee tranche so that they could be contested after the election. That's had an enduring effect, and where Republicans are voting in precincts more and Democrats are voting absentee more. So it's become really complicated just to put all the pieces together and understand what's going on. With enough time, as the counting happens, it becomes clear. At about 1 in the morning in 2020, we'd pretty much figured out that Biden had won.
Mm.
But without a doubt, like the probability of it going the other way was really low. Um, this will be closer, so I don't think we're going to have a call on election night. There's going to be a lot to sort out, like where is this vote coming from, and can we make sense of it? And part of it's because our models are not, our models haven't quite caught up to the changes in the way people are voting. But also because it's just going to be close. And I think that the media have learned, especially from 2000, to like cool their jets when it's really close. It doesn't pay to be out there and call it first and make a mistake.
Mm.
Um, and it doesn't even pay to call it first and get it right, as Fox News proved.
Right.
It's Arizona. Like that was a really gutsy call and one that the rest of the media wouldn't have gone along with, but they did. They did it anyway, and uh, so um, the editors of that desk, the heads of that desk, were very much criticized by the management, and as a result, a few of them lost their jobs, and it was uh, it led to a real change in how they approach the election. So in 2022, Fox was like last to call a lot of elections. They just like we're just not going to call them. So I think the temptation to call it quickly is not going to be very strong in the media, and they'll let it sit out there. It'll take a while to count the votes. Like California takes 3 weeks by law to count the votes. So it's going to take a while. And if Georgia's going to hand count their ballots like they promised, it's going to take a while. It's
Mhm. Yeah. So it might be, would you recommend, having an early night on November the 5th?
exactly. You could have an election morning party, have a
Yeah.
breakfast, and
Yeah.
like
At least.
that'll be more exciting than
No, that's a good recommendation. Can we go to the other end and think about election integrity and given that each state runs its own election, I guess we can anticipate particular set of legal challenges for each of several states in November. Do you think states are going to be able to certify their results by December the 11th? And tell us a bit about what happens if they can't meet or don't meet that deadline. It sounds sort of pretty frightening.
So last time there were a bunch of lawsuits after the fact that got dealt with pretty quickly. So there will, if this election is, so if they just count and do an initial report, that'll all happen, I think, in a timely manner. So that'll probably take 2 to 3 weeks. Well, many of the states will be done in a week. So December 11th, however, is 6 weeks on from election day, or 5 weeks on from election day. There will be litigation in the lead up to the certification process, the finalization at the state level by the Secretary of State, in many of the states if it's contested, and as well as after. It's much easier to influence the certification than it is to overturn the certification. So those first 3 or so weeks after the election will be much more intense because people will be trying to say this group of ballots shouldn't be counted or that group of ballots shouldn't be counted. And we've got some sense of what might be at stake from the early filings. The early filings, the court cases that have gone on so far have had to do with claims of non-citizen voting, claims of people voting in the wrong place because the registration lists are out of date, and so forth. So some claims about UOCAVA ballots, those are uniformed and overseas civilians ballots, and a lot of disputes over things like the absentee ballots that get returned, were they signed, were they dated, and so forth. Did it look like the envelope had been manipulated? So there will be, so I think, lawsuits about those issues, which will all inform what votes should be counted in the final certification by the state. And then there might be contests after that certification. So the states do their own certification, and then the electors are certified on December 11th. That's the final date. And after that, things are set. If a state cannot certify its electors, it goes to the Electoral College. And there's a question about what every state has its own state law for dealing with this. There's a question about how that would come about. If the Electoral College cannot make a decision, then it goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, every state gets one vote based on the majority of the members in that state. And it's expected in that circumstance that the Republicans, and that'll reflect the 2024 election results, not the 2022 election results. So it's expected that even if the Republicans lose their majority in the House, they will still have a majority of states, just because of, how many small states there are, where they have the majority of the delegates, the representatives. So I think if the Electoral College cannot resolve this, then it gets kicked to the House, and likely the Republican would be chosen just for that reason.
Right. That's super interesting. I want to encourage, I'm sure everybody listening and watching has tons of questions, so please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A, and you can then I will then be asking Steve your questions, and with that in mind, a question came in which is a beautiful follow-up to what we were just talking about the December the 11th deadline and the states, etc. So this question is, please comment on the Vice President's role in certifying the Electoral College results in January 2025. As in these elections, Kamala Harris will be both Vice President and certifier of the election results in Congress. So that sounds like a really sticky question. Really interested in that.
Yeah, last time Pence was under enormous pressure to change the election outcome in some way, and didn't. It is a prerogative of the vice president as the preceding officer of to potentially influence the outcome. But I think Pence set the precedent. I think Harris would follow it, but it is like the peculiar circumstance where Harris will be in some sense deciding her own election. Which I don't know if we've ever had that. It'd have to go back, trying to remember who the presiding officer was when Jefferson was elected. That might be, that took 125 ballots in the House of Representatives. We've been there before. This won't
okay.
time we get there. But and on the first ballot, everyone is bound by their state rules, and then they're free.
So interesting. There's another excellent follow-up question. Are there laws that require a state to certify, say by the governor, even if one county refuses to certify? So is there a kind of override that can happen?
Yes, some of the states allow that, but some of them don't. So it's state by state. It's the state law. So some of the states, the governor could just go ahead and say, like, this small county is refusing to certify. I'm going to certify it anyway, because all you're doing is stopping. If it's a small county and it's not going to determine the outcome, you're just stopping the election from happening. So I'm going to bypass you. So
right. Right.
Some states don't have that provision.
In
which case they would not have a certified electoral count.
So interesting. another one. This is a long one. So here we go. The Federal Reserve has recently cut interest rates, and typically interest rate cuts tend to help the party in power. How does the rate cut help or hurt the candidates running for the presidency? Do you have any opinion about what happens to the financial markets as a result of a Harris win or a Trump win? And then if the Democrats retain the Senate and the Republicans retain the House, all the sort of variables. So yeah, following up on your comments on the economy early on in our conversation.
Okay, so several parts here. Let's start with like, does the rate cut or the really the economic performance matter? And if the incumbent was standing for office, yes, it would be like a very strong predictor, but it's less clear because it's Harris, the vice president, not the president, how much credit she will get for economic performance. And that's something we will see when it's all over. She should, if she was just being treated like a normal incumbent, she would be doing much more strongly than she is doing. She'd be a few points further ahead in the polls, or actually in the vote. So which we don't know yet. So it looks like she's not getting the economic credit that an incumbent normally would. Second part of the question, whether we can zip ahead to the House and Senate because we haven't talked about that. It's fascinating to think about what the different scenarios are if the House is split 50-50 and Trump wins the election, then the Republicans would control the Senate because the Senate's provisions are that the presiding officer of the Senate is the vice president, and the vice president would cast a tie-breaking vote in the event of a tie. Now, that was thought up at a time when the rule for vice president was different historically, because that was thought up when the president was the top vote getter and the vice president was the second highest vote getter in the election at the end of the 18th century. That was the original plan. But we've since changed it so that the vice president runs it along with the president, so they're the same party. Early on, it was meant to be opposite parties. So it was supposed to be this check going one way or the other so that nobody could really control the office. But we short-circuited that a long time ago. The other fascinating question is whether or not whoever the president is going to come in with divided control or unified control. When since Bush had unified control, Obama had unified control, Trump had unified control, and Biden had unified control for the first 2 years of their presidencies. And Bush's was a little odd because they had senators coming and going. And that gave them greater leeway in enacting their pet legislation. And once they lost that control, they did less well in getting their particular agenda through Congress. So if one of the parties that coming out of this election comes in with unified control, I think that would give them a big boost, and that would have a rebound effect on how the markets judge it. Like, this is very clear what we're doing. If you come in and you've got divided government, then the markets are going to react differently than if it's, say, unified Democratic divided or unified Republican. Divided government means that they're going to have to negotiate over everything. So that'll actually lead to less changes in things. I think there's some big questions about this election that will affect the next round of the markets in the future. One of the big questions is the tax bill. A lot of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, Trump's signature piece of legislation from 2017, is expiring in 2025. And they're going to have to go back, like, what are they going to do about the corporate rate? What are they going to do about all the tax deductions and so forth? And a lot's on the table from both campaigns in that regard. The other thing is, how are they going to manage different budgeting and debt questions and whether or not the markets will have confidence. I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the markets right now, and there will be whoever wins, just having some certainty is going to help the markets.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. Well, here's a really scary question. We like that. What are the chances that the likely mess that this election will result in, and the mess of the last one, will cause this country to move to a simple majority win in the popular vote? Really interesting. So kind of throw it all up in the air and have a completely different system.
So it's unclear what it takes to change that. This is basically how do you get rid of the Electoral College? And there is an effort to get states to commit their electoral votes to the popular vote winner, regardless of how your voters voted. That's getting up there. It's I think around 200 electoral votes worth of states have passed that. If it gets to 270, then you've essentially short-circuited the Electoral College because enough states would have committed to the popular vote winner. The problem with that might be a constitutional problem. I'm sure it would get challenged. And the constitutional question is whether or not a state can commit its voters' votes to someone else's votes, or whether that's a violation of their voting rights. Now, it's complicated for many reasons, one of which is there's no constitutional recognition that you have a right to vote.
Wow.
Right? It's not, the right to vote isn't in the Constitution. So for that, for the court to side with that would be to really clearly say that there's a defined right to vote. So it's like a very interesting thing for whichever way that would come out. But so that movement is afoot, and it's been pushing for years to try to get this passed, and it might accelerate. If things are a big enough mess, it might accelerate. Let's get rid of this Electoral College idea. The other thing that would be required would be an amendment to the Constitution. I think that would be hard to pass because I think the Republicans view this as an advantage, and I think the Republican states wouldn't go for it. And so it'd be very hard to convince enough state legislatures to amend the Constitution.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. By the way, everybody, the questions coming in, thank you so much. They're really, really good. We could be here for a while, but I will pick them out and we'll go fast. Another very interesting question, Steve. I know you've done work on elections in other countries, so I think this is a great question for you. How does the overall integrity of the US election process compare with that of other developed democratic countries? Is the real data to make that comparison?
So integrity has a couple of aspects to it. One is like the amount of fraud or kind of attacks on the system that are meant to change election outcomes. Those do occur, but they're quite rare. And they get prosecuted and people get sent to jail and elections get overturned if the amount of fraud is big enough to change the election. So there's an example in North Carolina a few years back where there was a set of operatives who went through and ballot address by address and collected, convinced people to share their absentee ballots with them and destroyed all of the opponents' absentee ballots. And it was to the tune of 1,200 votes. And that was bigger than the margin in that particular congressional election. And so North Carolina had a new election and those people went to jail. So that's a good story and a bad story at the same time. So it does happen. It does get prosecuted in consequential ways. There's another side of it, which is just the complexity of running an election on this scale. It's really hard. You're dealing with 200 million roughly registered voters. It's like, and it's administered at the county level and often at the town level. And in many counties, it's essentially volunteers running the elections, right? You have to have a pretty big county has the administrative staff to have a full-time election office, but a rural small county doesn't. And the people at the polls are themselves volunteers everywhere. So it's a system that we trust and that people rise to the occasion and behave well on the whole. But there is a great amount of trust in it. I started working really intensely on that after the 2000 election and have continued that work. And we monitor different indicators of how well elections are being run in the United States. And it's gotten much better since 2000. In 2000, there were a lot of old technologies, old practices that were just getting in the way of running elections well. And also the lack of kind of communication among all the election directors. And it really has changed and improved by every indicator substantially. So I think the result is that if we end up recounting ballots, the recounts are much closer to the original counts. The tabulation's gotten better. If we're disputing registrations, the registration lists have gotten better. Before 2000, there were no before 2006, there were no statewide voter registration lists. There was no way to even tell who should be registered to vote. So now we can actually see things and monitor things and track things. So it's gotten a lot better, and there's a lot more to improve, as many of the disputes we're having suggest. But I think we're not going to be in the world of 2000 if we're recounting votes again.
That's just absolutely great to hear. It's great to hear about, very significant improvement. A question on another angle about debates. So we've only had two debates, one presidential debate and one vice presidential debate. Do debates matter? Do they change people's mind? Do they convince people to come out to vote?
Well, we've had 3 debates.
Yeah, I guess with the with the actual people who are actually running.
Yeah. And normally the political science on this says like normally debates don't matter at all, but every once in a while they do.
Yeah.
And I think that the Biden debate is a rare instance where there was clearly a substantial effect of the debate on people's judgments about the president and his ability to perform over maybe not coming year, but over the next 4 years. And people had doubts. People on the president's own party had doubts. So I think that was an indication of like where debates really matter. But usually debates are the candidates saying the things that they want to say and that they're saying elsewhere. So it's very hard to see an independent and separate effect of the debate because it's also what they're putting in their advertising. It's what they're saying on the campaign trail and their speeches and so forth. So it's not distinctive. If we didn't have debates, then there wouldn't be the kind of Biden type moment, which was, I think, it is the most important moment of this election.
No, thanks. That's really important. I have a question that loops us back really nicely and interestingly to sort of where we started. What role, if any, does income, education, or big issues like climate, healthcare, immigration, or abortion play in people's voting habits?
This is great. We've started a survey called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study 20 years ago. We've interviewed 750,000 people over the course of the last 2 decades. And so we've been looking at like, what are the fundamental divisions now in the US electorate and what were they in the past and how do different groups align and what do they care about? And we've come down to really there are four big groups. It was like, and they're not the groups that we thought they would be. um, uh, uh, on the right, white evangelicals are very Republican and have a distinctive set of issues that they care about. And on the left, um, uh, blacks, uh, LGBTQ, and atheists and agnostics, some people call them seculars, are very democratic in their voting. Once you take into account those identities, everything else is in the middle. Like Catholics are in the middle, Hispanics are in the middle. And by the middle, we mean somewhere between 60 and 40. They're splitting, 10 points one way or the other. Um, and veterans are in the middle, like it was like any number of divisions. Education's in the middle. That surprises, and income is really not a divider. If you went back to 1980 in the exit polls, income was the biggest division in the U.S. electorate, and that went away. That got supplanted by basically religiosity, where evangelicals, white evangelicals, are on one side, and atheists and agnostics are on the other side. These groups have also grown. They were relatively small or non-existent in exit polls in the 1970s and 80s. So these are kind of new social groups that are where we're kind of, as a society, trying to figure out what they want. They differ in what they want. So the LGBTQ community and the atheist and agnostic voters really care about climate change. It's very high on their agenda, but the evangelicals don't care about it at all. They don't want it on the national agenda. They want to keep things as it is. So the white evangelicals care a lot about immigration, and they care a lot about crime. Blacks and LGBTQ care a lot about civil rights. So they're not unsurprising that these are the divisions, but they are divisions actually less about what we do on these issues, more about which issues should we be dealing with. So they're about the agenda you'd want to put forward if one of those groups was your base. So what Trump is saying and doing is completely consistent with what the base of the Republican Party wants, and what Biden had done and what Kamala Harris is saying is completely consistent with what the base groups in the Democratic Party want.
No, thank you for that. Some people have wondered whether the 2024 election will be a critical election. Can you explain to us what a critical election is in the political science sense? And then do you think the 2024 election will be one of those, having defined it?
So a critical election is an election that leads to embodies a long-term enduring change in the partisan control of government, or in the alignment of the parties on certain issues that are very important issues. So the 1896 election gave the Republicans a very strong advantage over many decades after that. The 1932 election gave the Democrats a strong advantage for many decades after that. Those were critical elections in the sense that the winner of those parties became kind of the dominant party for a few decades. There are other shifts that occur that are tied to issues or party positions on things like civil rights. The Democrats changed considerably in the 1960s on civil rights in ways that drove white Southerners out of the Democratic Party because they were part of its base and into the Republican Party. So people point to the late 60s, early 70s as a period of realignment. And so the 72 election might be, and 68 election might be critical elections for the sake of issues. I don't see this as a critical election in terms of partisan alignments. The parties are pretty evenly split, Democrat, Republican, and nothing's really changed them. The 1896 and 1932 elections came right after depressions, like massive economic dislocations that led people to just move away from one of the parties. And I don't see anything like that happening here. But we are seeing a realignment of the parties around especially around trade, tariffs, and I think the US's place in the world. And I think that has bigger implications abroad than it does at home potentially. So the Republicans since the 1950s had been the free trade party. And the Democrats shifted in the 1990s to try to take some of that, take advantage of some of that. Trump in 2016, so if there was a critical election, it was 2016 on trade, Trump changed the party's base on that and the party's position, where they're the protectionist party. And that had a lot of appeal to white workers who were in industrial jobs, either jobs that have left and they felt bitter about having lost them, or that need protection, such as the Detroit area. So Trump's flipped it, and now the Democrats are now trying to run back to being protectionist, trying to undo the Clinton era policies.
Really interesting. We're getting towards time, and I'm going to cheat. I'm going to ask you two questions that are very much on my mind, squashed into one, and you can choose how far you answer each of them. I'm dying to know what you'll be doing behind the scenes on, I think it is on CBS on election night, and would you have a punt on who's going to win? Those are my two naughty questions squished into one.
I think hunt in the American sense rather than the English sense.
Yeah.
Uh,
You've got it. Yeah.
I see this as a very close election, and it's just going to be hard to call. And that means that there will be litigation afterward as well if it's as close as it looks. So it could take a while. It could have all the anxieties we had last time wrapped up afterward. What I do, so all of the networks have their own teams of experts that they've pulled together. So they usually have an internal person and one or more external people. CBS has a particularly good and big team. So we have a person who created YouGov, who's a professor at Stanford, and me, and they have a few folks on staff. And then we have consultants from the Democratic and Republican Party. So that, like, if we're saying something, we don't want to say something that makes a party or the party says, no, we don't see it that way. We think you should not be doing this. But the whole group works together to try to resolve things. So we have different data streams. So it's like fantasy for quantitative social scientists. It's like data, real time. We're doing a real time forecast, which is like the election's already happened. And then slowly, you get to see the first 10%, the next 10%, or 5%. And at what point do you have a good enough picture to call the whole thing? That's the challenge. And how do we help the news anchors tell the story of what happened? Right? What's the narrative? And so we've developed models that ingest the data. So what's happened, it's got the precinct level data, the voter registration data, the absentee vote data, and the polls. And we're just pulling it all into the models and seeing how they're running. If the models are all consistent, then we feel like, okay, and clearly in one direction, like, okay, we can call that race for that person. So we have to go through all 50 presidential races, the 34 Senate races, the handful of governors this election, and the US House. So we call it all. And we all have different sets of states that we're in charge of. What we try to do is get the easy calls off the table first, and then the marginal ones off the table. And then we really, work hard to try to figure out what's going on in the really close races, the 7 or so states that are just going to keep us up all night. And we've developed some nice models for the House, because the House, like, all the seats are swinging one way or another. Can we capture those swings and make a sensible, correct call about who has won election? The other thing that's happening, which I think people find astonishing, and the first time I saw it, I was like, wow, that's great, actually. All the news media buy the exit poll. So everybody contributes. But the other benefit to buying the exit poll is that all the news media are talking to each other all night long on a closed circuit radio called a McCarty. So everybody's talking. So if the New York Times wants to call a race and we don't think you should, we will tell them, don't do that. And they can listen to us or not, but at least we give our reasoning. So we say, look at this data or look at that data. So it prevents people from making rash decisions. What happened in 2020 is that Rupert Murdoch decided not to buy the exit poll as a financial matter. So Fox was out. They were out of the loop, out of the conversation. So they were flying blind. They didn't have us to check them, and we saw exactly the same pattern, but we did not want to call it. We just like, there's no gain in calling it. It's just going to be close. And if you're wrong, and you could easily be wrong, it's not worth it. So Fox made a ballsy decision there, and they did it because of a financial calculation, which I think turned out to be the wrong calculation because it didn't value the value of the community talking to each other and trying to figure out what had happened.
This is amazing. Yeah, thank you. And you're such a great example of what you can do with a Harvard PhD. Thank you so much. This was incredible.